seat of wisdom, pray for us. In an essay addressed to Catholic academic women, Edith Stein noted 100 years ago that the secular feminist movement has no stability in it. She pointed out that the admission of women to the university had begun enthusiastically under the mantles of 19th century idealism, individualism, and liberalism, but that in her time, the new ideology of National Socialism had progressively crushed, her words, progressively crushed that women's movement in favor of a different ideal of women's value in national life. In particular, the Third Reich, wanted women to stay home and bear children. She noted in contrast that our foundation, and what did she mean? The church's foundation, cannot tremble. This is how she put it, because we have built on solid ground. Our guiding star is not the liberal ideal of humanity and femininity conditioned by time, she wrote. Rather, our ideal, the church's ideal, is one which exists prior to all time and which will endure for all time. So what exactly is this ideal which exhibits an otherworldly constancy? So Edith advances what she understands even then, at that time, to be an outrageous claim. She says, "Woman is created by God to stand by her husband's side, to stand with him over and above all other creatures. She is bound to him as the helpmate who corresponds to him in an enduring and indissoluble coexistence." She knows this is outrageous at the time. Then she moves on and she draws from the second passage of Genesis. She writes, "The Hebrew expression used in this passage of Genesis is barely translatable, ezer kenegdo, which means literally a helper as if vis-a-vis unto him." She continues, "God created male and female, in his own image, but God is 3 in 1. Moreover, God is love. There must be at least 2 persons for love to exist," she says. "So it is not a question here of sovereignty of man over woman. She is named as companion and helpmate. It is said of man that he will cling to her and that both are to become one flesh." And she says, "This signifies that we are to consider the life of the initial human pair as the most intimate community of love." So Edith provides, when she is answering this question, specifically counter to the vision of secular feminism, an ideal of woman as helpmate, the helpmate as if face to face, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, helpmate in the work of love, after a pattern, the pattern of divine communion. So in longer essays, Edith extends this scriptural foundation in Genesis to an exposition of the twofold vocation of woman, spouse and mother. And she extends this to a complete defense, then, of the threefold purpose of marriage: fidelity, fruitfulness, and sacrament or grace. And she calls upon Catholic women to do the same, to defend the twofold vocation of woman and the threefold purpose of marriage. She specifically calls on academic women to do this. She says, "It is necessary today," and again today is 100 years ago for her, "to preserve this traditional conception of marriage against the pressure of public opinion, which has undermined a mere middle-class morality. It is a vital question for our nation and the entire human race that the Church's conception of womanhood stay preserved. It can be preserved on no theoretical foundation other than the teaching of the Catholic faith. In order so that it be preserved, women must grasp this concept in the depths of their being and live accordingly. They must brave the onslaught of contemporary opinion and help their sisters to do likewise." It is stunning to me that Edith should write these words already a century ago, before Bostock and Obergefell, before Roe and Griswold, before the universal adoption of no-fault divorce, and even before the Anglican Church had seen fit to deviate from the traditional teachings which we now associate solely with the faith of the Roman Catholic Church. But to return to the ideal of woman as helpmate, Edith cannot get far in its exposition before revealing her full hand, the full hand of God. She says, "Although there is no loftier nor holier concept of marriage than that of our Church, the Church knows something more exalted. The woman presented to our vision as the image of maternity for all times had decided to belong to no man. She placed her whole being in the service of the Lord. Thus did she become the prototype of virginity, which is consecrated to God, and the prototype of the spouse of Christ. As an aside, don't you love the phrase, the image of maternity for all times? As a helpmate to the divine spouse, Mary, the Blessed Mother, stands at the Lord's side to assist, as if face to face, in the work of love after the pattern of divine communion. I am the handmaid of the Lord, she says. She might say, I'm the helpmate of the Lord. Let it be done to me as you say. So Edith's full hand, which she is eager to reveal, is just this, that to be the helpmate of the Lord cannot be a lowly vocation, unless Mary's vocation is lowly. But this is impossible. Mary's vocation is exalted. She's the Queen of Heaven. So Edith continues, making this explicit in a very important passage from another essay on woman and the church. The highest form of life to which one can be called is a life of eternal union with God. It is the vocation of each human soul and the mission of the church. But no one embodies it more forcefully than the woman whose entire life is devoted to the service of the Lord. The argument Edith is making is a difficult one. She is not saying that every woman is called to be consecrated or religious. And she is not saying that only consecrated religious women are, say, as holy as possible. This is her argument as I understand it, kind of in 4 parts. First, the highest form of life is union with God, or kind of spousal union. Second, the mission of the church is to bring about this form of life in as many souls as possible, to conceive and to give birth to new souls who will be in union with God. Third, that woman was specifically formed and created from the beginning to be spouse. She was created to be a helpmate after this pattern of divine communion and to be mother. Therefore, woman, in her creation, is called upon to embody in her highest development the essence of the church, to be its symbol. Woman is symbol of the church. So here, there is no avoiding that Edith Stein is a philosopher. She is arguing about form or about essence. When we see the seed of an apple, we understand that the seed cannot grow into anything but an apple. It possesses an inner form, we might say, which in proper soil with nutrients urges its own development into an apple tree. So Edith also understands men and women in the same way, that we have an inner form of maleness and femaleness which urges our own development towards certain outcomes. Just like with the apple, we might describe the ideal apple of its type, or we might be able to pick out a specific apple and say, here is an apple which represents the highest and purest development of this apple. For Edith, woman is called to maternity in her essence. She says, in another great passage, only the person blinded by controversy could deny that woman in soul and body is formed for a particular purpose. The clear and irrevocable word of Scripture declares what daily experience teaches us from the beginning of the world, that woman is destined to be wife and mother. She comes out swinging, if you will, right? There's no sweeping this under the rug. She's going to just make the best possible case. She goes on then to argue that a woman's whole being is directed toward the reception and nurturing of new life, and that she, a woman, is at the height of her powers when, cooperating with nature and grace, she actualizes the fullness of life in another. And it is this essential sameness of mission between woman and the church to conceive and nurture new life, which makes it appropriate to say that woman is the symbol of the church. For Edith, woman is also called in her essence to stand in relation to man, to her husband, or to God, as the church stands in relation to Christ. She writes, Genesis places woman by man's side as a suitable helpmate to him in order for both to be able to work together as a single nature. The letter to Ephesians describes this relationship as that of head and body, and thereby as a symbol of Christ's relationship to the church. Accordingly, she says, Woman is to be understood as symbol of the church. The creation of Eve from the rib of the first Adam becomes a prefigurement for the emergence of the new Eve. And by that is meant Mary, but at the same time also the whole church, from the open side of the new Adam, who is Christ, right? So both, on this schema, both married and consecrated women represent the church as Christ's bride. Each married and consecrated women stand at his side, like the church, and assist in the work of redemption, like its prototype, the Mother of God, in whom the church has its origin. The complete surrender of her entire life and being is to live and work with Christ. But that also means to suffer and to die with him. That fruitful death from which springs the life of grace for all humanity. This is difficult. Nothing is more useful, says Pope Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum, than to look upon the world as it really is. We might, he's talking about socialism, of course, but we might ask at this point what Edith's exposition has to do with feminism, secular or Christian. What is a woman's place or role in the church on this schema? Where is her power? What is her contribution? How is she measured against others? But upon formulating the question in light of what we have learned, we see that the question is malformed, and it cannot be answered as such. The handmaid of the Lord is not a role in a structure. It is not an earthly power, and it is not a contribution. It has no metric. Woman is called to be for a spousal relationship after the pattern of divine communion. We are in the realm of being here, and not in the realm of doing. For this reason, Edith and those influenced by her, especially John Paul II, Edith and John Paul II track with various secular feminists, not all, but various ones, insisting that there is nothing that a woman cannot be or do, right? But that is because it is not the operative question. It is not very important what it is that we can or can't do. When a woman finds and knows her identity in Christ, this is as John Paul II would put it, she understands her own mystery. When she understands her own mystery in the reality of the incarnation, she, like Mary, discovers that her identity is maternity after the pattern of divine communion. And then the operative question is not, what is my role? The operative question is, how will this take place in me, like Mary, right? How will this take place in me, she says, because I do not know man. So practically speaking, any role in secular life is a role that a woman can pursue, so long as she privileges her spousal relationship and her maternity in whatever way God has called her, wife and mother, religious or consecrated, or even single for the Lord. Each of these paths bears a metaphysical reality. Woman naturally accomplishes in her path, in her way, her capacity for motherhood, that nurturing receptivity to the other, which seeks the full or complete maturation of the other in the life of grace. Of course, when it comes to roles in the church, it is true that a woman cannot be a priest, but that is because it is a being that she is not. If the priesthood were a matter of accomplishing tasks, presiding over liturgies, ministering to people's needs, saying certain words, wearing garments, well, of course a woman can do any of these things. She might even do them better than a given priest that you know. But the structure of her being, her essence, her femaleness is spousal maternity. She just is the figure and the image of the bride of Christ, the church. She cannot at the same time be the figure and image of Christ. We are bumping up then against a kind of double standard. The double standard that she can do and be anything in the secular life, any profession, any vocation, but she can't do or be anything in the church. So why this double standard? The church established by Jesus Christ is a supernatural society. Our membership in it and our relationship to it are not of human design, nor of human convention. Its best analog in natural life is the human family, the family founded on relationship of love, again after the pattern of divine communion, is not of human design and nor of human convention. If it were either, it might be subject to a kind of change or revision, a little updating maybe as we go along. So with the church, her parameters are metaphysical ones. We are conceived and born and flourish within these parameters, because it is for grace, the life of God, that we were made. We actually wither away, we starve, and we perish without the milk of the church. And we are, in fact, precisely powerless to change these things. But why, in fact, to pick up again on Edith's thought, why, in fact, would we wish to? Why would we strive after poverty and death when the King invited us to his table? And why should we grasp after earthly accounts of power when as handmaidens of the King we have access to power above all power, thrones above all thrones, and authority above all authority? In that same essay on women in academic life, Edith Stein pointed out, quoting another Catholic scholar, that on the feminist issue, she said, although we seem to come later, in reality we were there earlier. What is meant by this is that the Church from her first inception elevated the concept of woman and provided, in fact, the only firm and lasting foundation for the defense of the rights of women. That she is bound to the King in love and serves at his side. So, in a word, with Thérèse of Lisieux, the little flower, we can say, I understood, this is what Thérèse said, I understood that love comprised all vocations, that it embraced all times and places. In a word, that it was eternal. In our own time, like in Edith's, we can see how certain ideologies now threaten the socio-political status of women, just as National Socialism did in Edith's time. For instance, certain transgender ideologies. We can also in this context see why the battle over certain aspects of the so-called reproductive rights movement, ranging from contraceptives to abortion, are so consequential. They really cut to the heart of what it is to be a woman. If a woman is, in her essence, formed and called for maternity, then there can't be a right to kill her offspring. Worse, to kill her offspring is an attack on herself, as much as it is an attack on her child. So we're not debating whether the life of an unborn child can be taken simpliciter, right? We are debating what it is to be a woman, and whether a woman's power rests in receiving and nurturing new life, or whether it rests ultimately in the ability to end a life once received. On Edith's terms, the latter view is not merely anti-child, it's anti-woman and anti-God, since God himself has invited woman into this relationship of love and receptivity. So this is starting to sound a bit cosmic, and if you think I'm getting cosmic, I'm going to bring John Paul II to the table in my defense. He wrote of this as well in Mulieris Dignitatem. So now I'm quoting from that letter of John Paul II on women. He said, "It is also to be noted how the same woman who attains the position of a biblical exemplar also appears within the eschatological perspective of the world and of humanity given in the book of Revelation. She is a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of stars. One can say," John Paul II says, "that she is a woman of cosmic scale, on a scale with the whole work of creation. At the same time, she is suffering the pangs of childbirth, like Eve, the mother of all the living. She also suffers because before the woman who is about to give birth, before her stands the great dragon, the ancient serpent." This is from Revelations, right? "The ancient serpent, already known from ancient times, the evil one, the father of lies. The ancient serpent wishes to devour her child." I'm continuing to read to you from John Paul II. He says, "While we see in this text an echo of the infancy narrative of St. Matthew's Gospel, we can also see that the struggle with evil and the evil one marks the biblical exemplar of the woman from the beginning to the end of history," right? The terms of this debate about the nature of woman are fundamentally spiritual ones, not political. There will always be another specter around the corner, and nothing should surprise us. But the Church's foundation, her vision, is always the same. Woman, in her femaleness and her capacity for maternity, is wanted for her own sake. She's loved for her own sake, and she is raised up for her own sake. To quote John Paul II again, the bridegroom is the one who loves. The bride is loved. It is she who receives love in order to return that love. And the dignity of woman is measured by the order of love, which is essentially the order of justice and charity. So this is very deep, right? What I'm saying is not simple. But you start to, when you trace your finger through these various writers in the Church who've spoken about this mystery, you start to find these beautiful overlapping patterns. And those are the kinds of patterns I wanted to bring to you tonight. In these reflections up till now, I have hinted a little bit at the language of royalty. Woman is exalted, I've said. She is raised up. She is espoused to the king. And through this relationship, and only through it, she may command power above all power and is invited to a throne above all thrones. She is the helpmate of God, the bride of Christ, and the living symbol of the Church. These are not merely figurative things that I'm saying. They are not nice symbols of a distant fairy world. The challenge to our imagination and the reason to protect our imagination as a spiritual gift, which is a subject for quite another lecture, is to see that these metaphysical realities are more real. They're more real than our earthly ones, right? This isn't airy fairy tales. The saints and the mystics who have learned to pray, who have learned to dwell in the house of self-knowledge, as Catherine of Siena calls it, or the interior castle, as Teresa of Avila calls it, have often been granted the gift of seeing that the supernatural, the things I'm describing to you, are actually what is weighty and more real. And that these saints, often after a vision of these things, will say that the natural world seems thin and flimsy and disposable. To take just one example, in case you haven't read these passages, I have one from Teresa of Avila, which I very much like. She tells of a time near the Feast of the Assumption, which we're coming up on this next month, in a convent church of the Order of St. Dominic, when she was seized during the Holy Mass by an intense rapture, an elevation of spirit in which she was visited by Our Lady and St. Joseph. She says, "I seemed to see myself clothed in a robe of great whiteness and clarity, and Our Lady seemed to hang around my neck a very beautiful gold collar, from which hung a cross of great value. The gold and the stones were so different from those of this world. There is no comparing them. Their beauty is quite unlike anything we can imagine here. Nor can the imagination rise to any understanding of the nature of the robe, nor any conception of its whiteness. Such was the vision that the Lord was pleased to send me, that by comparison, everything here on earth seems, as you might say, like a smudge of soot." So the faith that we profess not only offers us a vision of perfected womanhood that is exalted, royal, arrayed in gold and jewels, but one that surpasses all earthly conceptions of the same in a way that, like St. Paul says, eye has not seen. The Church, of course, celebrates and reflects on the crowning of Mary as Queen of Heaven, usually connected in some way with the Blessed Assumption. More than this, so much has God wished that woman should reveal in her person the great reality of the vocation of the soul, that in many instances he has bestowed the favor of the so-called mystical marriage upon one of the female saints. The Catholic Encyclopedia of 1910, so again, more than 100 years ago, reported 77 known mystical marriages, all female saints. Notably Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, Angela of Foligno, Catherine of Alexandria, obviously many, many more. The encyclopedia says that a mystical marriage, what is that thing? A mystical marriage is understood in the ordinary sense as a vision in which Christ tells a soul that he takes it for his bride, presenting it, the soul, with the customary ring, and the apparition is then accompanied by some kind of ceremony. Usually the Blessed Virgin or saints or angels are present. And this festivity is but the accompaniment and the symbol of a purely spiritual grace. We don't know exactly what this grace consists in, but it might be said at least that the soul receives a sudden augmentation of charity and familiarity with God, right? God is now the spouse of the soul, and that he will take special care of it. Moreover, as a wife should share in the life of her husband, and as Christ suffered the redemption of mankind, the mystical spouse enters into a more intimate participation in his sufferings. Okay, right? So I'm kind of going back to something I said before. The woman who is in Revelation is in agony, right? So she enters into a more intimate participation in his sufferings. Accordingly, in 3 cases out of every 4, the mystical marriage has been granted to stigmatics, right? Women who have received the wounds of Jesus Christ in their body, right? It is of this last point that progress in love of God always implies a greater capacity to suffer for the beloved, to which my title, Jewel and Cross, was meant to refer, taking the cue originally from Teresa of Avila's vision. Around her neck was placed a collar of gold and jewels, from which hung a cross of great value. Or to return to Edith Stein's language, the complete surrender of her entire life and being is to live and work with Christ. But that means also to suffer and to die with him, that fruitful death from which springs the life of grace for all humanity. Now, Catherine of Siena was both a stigmatic and the wearer of a mystical crown offered by Jesus, and a mystical marriage. We are told that she was offered a crown of jewels, but that she instead asked Jesus to exchange her crown of jewels for a crown of thorns, to be more closely resembled to Christ, her groom. So this is a very important clue as to the nature of crowns and other royal dressings, such as scepters and robes and jewels. And I want to talk about this for 1 minute. In our weakness, I think, or maybe just our poverty, we easily think of a crown, for instance, as itself, the crown itself, conferring honor or dignity upon the wearer. But the reality is something like the opposite. A crown or a scepter is an outward sign of an inward reality. A coronation, then, the receiving of a crown, is somewhat sacramental. Likewise, a groom gives a gem or a ring to his beloved not to make her valuable, right? The ring doesn't make the spouse valuable. Rather, it provides a visible sign of the value he already places on her. So this implies a kind of dynamism, a scepter or a crown, but indeed the gift of any lover to a beloved, rightly inspires a return of action. The beloved strives to conform herself to the gift, to be worthy of the gift, to be worthy of the value that the lover places in her. Hence, hence she who is Christ's bride, say, as Catherine of Siena did, wishes instead for the painful crown, and none other than the painful crown, because it is his crown, and he is hers, right? So this is very beautiful. This is about the structure of love. More beautifully still, a woman who is conformed through her choices, through virtue, to the calling, the handmaid of the Lord and mother of souls, image of the church. She becomes, as it were, the very symbols of royalty that she is offered by the king. If you think for a minute, a scepter, what is a scepter? A scepter is a royal staff. It is the word scepter is derived from a Greek word that means to lean on, something that you lean on. A handmaid, therefore, or a helper, is one who can be leaned upon. We might rightly call Mary the scepter of God. And we will see how frequently mystics like Teresa of Avila use the language of being called into service of so great a king. It's an expression she likes very much. Make use of me, Lord, right? Lean on me, Lord. Similarly, we know that in the physical act of birthing a new human person, A woman in her own body is stretched so completely that her flesh becomes a crown upon the head of a new infant, precisely at the moment of birth. In fact, in the delivery of a baby, this is referred to as the crowning. I need not say how much this crowning is truly a crown of thorns, as it were a fruitful death from which springs life. As our Lord says, though, after her passion she forgets her pain and rejoices that a man has come into the world. Thus, woman is at the same time scepter of God and crown of humanity, in that it is through her action, quite literally, that new souls are born into life. And this truth is quite the same, whether it is physical or spiritual maternity that we are talking about. Now, I don't know about you, but in relation to these realities, the worldly concerns of secular feminists seem to me indeed like a smudge of soot. No wonder Edith spent so little time debunking them, and this is true, and so much time instead explaining the truth about the mystery of woman. Some bad ideas may be defeated by logic. Others are crushed more readily by the strength of beauty. Following Edith, let's aim to talk about truth more often, and about falsehood less often, to talk about the saints more often, and about sin less often. The opponents of God have no such arsenal. In the very brief time that remains, I want to take my own advice. Where we have reflected so far on what is true about woman and the church, let us now reflect a little bit on that Dominican saint, the adorable and brilliant stigmatist of the 14th century, whose grasping for the crown of thorns reveals so much to us about the nature of love. Saint Catherine Benincasa, died on April 29th in 1380 in Rome. She was just 33 years old, so that's, by our standards, very young, right? Just maybe a smidge older than some of you. She was mourned bitterly when she died by her spiritual children, when she passed, and men and women of all ages called her Mama, actually. One of only 4 female doctors of the church, John Paul II just recently really named her a patron saint of Europe on the eve of the 3rd millennium in 1999. Here's a way of thinking about her greatness as a teacher of the faith. Together with Holy Scripture, would her writings perhaps suffice as a complete lesson in the Christian life? If you could choose one text, and one text only, to accompany your spiritual journey, would her work be enough? And the answer to this, even if you haven't studied it yet, is a resounding yes. And I mean, of course, the dialogue, but also her letters, which bear all the marks of her distinctive personality, together with an astonishing kind of freshness in the development of mystical ideas that are soundly within the tradition, though hardly of it. One hardly knows what to make of one translator and commentator who remarked about the dialogue that theologically there is nothing new or original. There is hardly enough reproach I could summon for this conclusion. The commentator slices up Catherine's work as a kind of theological combinatorics, a little bit of Augustine, Cassian, Gregory the Great, Bernard, Francis, Thomas. The commentator says she absorbs them and integrates them, but nothing new or original. But this is quite wrong. In fact, Catherine is a saint upon whom we should reflect now for many other reasons than that she rises above other saints, or that she presents a teaching with a singular type of sufficiency. So I want you to consider for a moment the time in which she lived. There is, in the second half of the 14th century, a great political tumult in Italy. There's revolution in Siena itself in 68 and 69, 1368 and 69. In 1372, Pope Gregory XI declares war on Milan, the city of Milan. They're all city-states, right? Tuscany then, the whole area of Tuscany, is then incited to revolt against the Pope. Tuscany is especially inflamed against the papal nuncio, who is supporting the Sienese nobles against them. Gregory announces his intention to return to Rome. He's already hiding out in Avignon. In 1373, we are told by a great historian of Italy that all the world was a place of shadows in Italy. It's a very difficult and dark time in Italy. As if this weren't enough, of course, we had the plague and famine. Tuscany was really laid to waste by famine in 1374, kind of after the ravages of the plague. And it got worse because the Pope kind of got involved, and the papal legate refused to allow corn. I mean, they were fighting, so corn wasn't allowed. So the Pope has some role in the famine. It's terrible. Florence then rebels against the Pope, raises a minor army against the Pope, and generally the roads in the countryside are considered to be unsafe. In 1375, and now remember, Catherine dies in 1380, so this is just 5 years before she dies. In 1375, Florence leads a league of 80 cities against the Pope. And right after this, the papal nuncio, right, the emissary that the Pope sends to Florence to make peace, he's flayed alive in the streets of Florence. Like, this is not a good death. Then the city is punished by the Pope and placed under it. And this goes on and on. I mean, this is terrible stuff. Finally, Catherine goes to Avignon to negotiate for peace and convince the Pope to come back to Rome. She first fails, and then later Gregory is swayed by Catherine and comes back to Rome in 1377, but then he dies in 1378. And this ends the so-called Babylonian captivity of the papacy in Avignon. So it's a pretty big deal that had begun in 1309. But then right away, Urban VI is elected the successor, and a kind of peace is made. But then very shortly after that, certain cardinals begin to circulate rumors that the election of the Pope was invalid, and they elect another Pope, right? So then we have two popes. And this begins the Great Schism, which lasts for over 40 years. By the time the Great Schism ends in 1417, more or less, there were not 2 but 3 claimants to the papacy. So it's sort of just really amazing time. So if you reviewed all of these things and you thought, what about Catherine's world? It's marked by what kinds of things? Well, 4 kinds of things. First is political nuttiness, right? War, a gross spirit of intemperance in civil and political matters. Like, murder is commonplace. Violence is just expected, and chaos is the norm. The second thing is that her world is ravaged by disease and sickness, just to begin with, and then spiritual disease and sickness, so greed and avarice and unchastity. And the priesthood at her time is especially known for corruption, for gluttony, and for unchastity. She talks about this many times. Third, the papacy of her time, right, is a weak and cowardly papacy. She uses the term swollen. She says the papacy is swollen with pride. The papacy of her time was also overly merciful to those who should have been disciplined. And it was overly concerned with favors to friends and relations, right? There was a kind of hobnobbing of the papacy with the elites of Europe, really. And the fourth thing is that Catherine's world is marked by the brink of schism. So these are tough things, and I wonder if we don't recognize some of these things in our current time. So without meaning to draw exact parallels, I think we might come to attention when we think about these aspects of St. Catherine's life and wonder what we can learn from the Seraphic Virgin. I've aimed then just to pull 3 lessons or 3 themes which relate to her spiritual maternity, right? So before we meditated on the truth of the mystery of woman in the church, and so now we have an example of woman in the church. And I wonder if it might serve as a prodding for us to take up her company ourselves, to place ourselves into her family, as it were, and to ask her to be our spiritual mother too, as she was called by her family. And you know, in reality, she was a very tiny woman, probably the size of Mother Teresa. You know that Mother Teresa was a very tiny person. And like Mother Teresa, this very tiny woman is called mother by everybody around her. It's a delightful image. So here are my 3 themes from her life, which I think speak to her modeling of this spiritual maternity, which is the vocation of woman. The first is that she had care for what we might call the complete human development or complete spiritual maturity of her spiritual family. This was sort of the primary concern for her. What do I mean by this? Well, Edith Stein says that the vocation of motherhood requires an orientation to the perfection of the complete or the whole person, including especially what? Including especially the integration of the emotions with the intellectual life in service of the contemplative life. right? So the imagination and the intellect in service of prayer. So when was the last time you went to school for prayer, right? Wholeness of development is so important to Edith Stein that I often wish she had written some kind of commentary on St. Catherine's work. She didn't. The fact is that you can't read the dialogue of St. Catherine and be content with the kind of deformed, out of proportion, lopsided formation that most of us exhibit. We are kind of intellectual or maybe perhaps physical brutes, actually, by Catherine's standard. So for Edith Stein and for St. Catherine, and for really all other spiritual masters, complete human development requires, and I'm just going to say this and you're going to find it strange, the activation of our spiritual powers. You have these muscles, you have this spiritual capacity, which is mostly unactivated unless you start to pray. And so this is important. So the activation of the spiritual powers, Edith uses this term very, very often, but in fact it can be taught. There's a science to it. There's something we can know about this. And yet, it is not the object of any particular formative environment that we've been in. Your elementary school, your high school, your college probably did not aim to form your spiritual habits with respect to the contemplative life. For the most part, you were probably not taught how to pray, nor were you schooled in the science of prayer. In consequence, you and I grow up as brutes of a certain kind. We know about physical brutes. We know all about them. Men usually, but could be women too, who are kind of all body but no brains, right? Even a kind of attenuated sensitivity to the beauty of the body, which is an obsession, we know, of our contemporaries. It is not any less brutish than a bodybuilder's brutishness, if you will. But there are also intellectual brutes, right? Persons who are all brain and no body, or worse, all brain and no heart, right? Indeed. But what unites brutes of all types is that the spiritual powers are fallow, right? They're laid to waste. What I'm saying then is that intellectual formation without the life of grace and in the activation of the spiritual powers which takes place through prayer can lead to another kind of brutishness. So Catherine describes the light of faith acquired through prayer as the eye of the mind, right? And this is worth dwelling on because it causes one to shudder a little bit at the possibility of the mind without an eye, or what I like to call the blind mind, right? So your mind can be very agile and quick and intelligent. You can do all kinds of difficult things, but it could be a blind mind. This is the mind without the light of faith, without the activation of the spiritual power. So the first idea from Catherine is that one cannot read the dialogue without confronting in a very real way the radical insufficiency of our present way of growing up in the faith, which is dangerously brutish in the sense of contributing to our warped development. So Catherine is very concerned. This is always the top concern for her among her spiritual children. The second thing, and I had three for you, the second thing is that Catherine fosters, if you read her dialogue, what I would call a maternal social theory. Okay, so this is a little theory-ish here, but it's a maternal social theory, without which the social teaching of the church, in my opinion, cannot be understood. So how so? So one of the great scholars of St. Catherine says, I'm quoting, her hopes were centered not like Dante's in the emperor, the heir of the Caesars, but in the Pope, the heir of Christ. Despite the corruption from which she recoiled with horror, despite the Babylonian captivity at Avignon, she still saw in the Catholic Church that image of a pure, universal fellowship which the noblest Catholics of all ages have cherished. To the service of the Church, therefore, her life was totally dedicated. It was to her the holy house of reconciliation, where all nations could dwell in unity, and only by submission to its authority could the woes of Italy, she thought, be healed. So if you read Catherine faithfully, you will find it absurd, the notion that she could assent to some kind of vision of social order in which the church lacked a privileged place. She's not a theorist per se. She presents a realist view of social order in which we are both of the following. We are steeped in sin. In her language, she says, we have lived our lives wholly in darkness, But at the same time, we are washed in the blood of Christ, and we rise up with desire for him. So she would approach questions of social order by thinking about spiritual realities as more vital and not less. So for instance, where we would see the stinking filth of sin as more stinky and more urgent than the stinking filth of disease or of human waste. There is a lot more one can say about what we would call social thought in Catherine, but what she offers is absolutely indispensable to a complete and proper reading of the 19th and 20th century social magisterium. Simply, we have in Catherine's teaching and life the priority of grace over policy. This is what I call a maternal social theory, because grace is the milk of the church, right? Grace is the milk of the church. There is also this theme which plays itself out over and over in Catherine's thought, and now I'm reading from the dialogue, that every virtue of yours and every vice is put into action by means of your neighbors. So this is a social thought, not of social contracts or of individualism or communalism. Instead, it's deeply maternal. The final point from her thought and from her life of her maternity is that she brings her children to the Father. So one of the most important roles of a good mother is to put her children in relationship with their father. Catherine's entire dialogue, which is, if you haven't read it, it's written in the first person of God the Father, is written as the voice of God the Father to Catherine, but indirectly to us. They are the words of a tender, sweet, and compassionate Father, to whom Christ points in the Scriptures, and who is almost completely silent, God the Father, in the Gospels. We don't hear his voice. When I first read the dialogue, I thought, like, where has this been all my life? It was a kind of treasure trove. And amazingly, this testimony is unknown to most people. I could read you lots of passages, but in the interest of time, I will pass over them. But suffice it to say that we live in an age that is in many ways unconnected to a correct notion of fatherhood, which means that it's unconnected to a correct notion of the Godhead, right? So it is probably easier for most of us, and you can examine yourselves, to think of Jesus Christ as a lover than to think of God the Father, whose paternal love searches us and provides for us. Catherine brings to us the locutions of the Father, and this is very important. So in conclusion, pulling these three notes of Catherine's life and teaching together, one might spy in them a proposal of sorts or an outline of contributions that women today can and should strive to make as brides of Christ in every pathway of life. First, to labor tirelessly for the spiritual maturity of others. Second, to labor tirelessly for the defense of true religion and the Holy Church. And third, to labor tirelessly to bring the love of the Father to an orphaned humanity. For these three goals, Catherine quite literally expended herself. We could be happy to follow her even in a small part. And we could be confident that the Lord who has commanded us to this task has also so equipped us. So here, dear students, I will bring these reflections to an end, reminding you that my purpose in bringing Catherine to your imagination was to introduce new horizons for the vista of feminine greatness. If I have gone on too long, and I did labor in vain to make this shorter, I do refer you to St. Catherine herself, who, writing to her spiritual father, once said, "Pardon me for writing too much, but my hands and my tongue go along with my heart." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pakaluk. That was absolutely wonderful. And to be honest, very affirming, to hear that there are voices down through the ages in the church that can actually really speak to issues that would seem like they're brand new to us today. So we have had a lot of questions coming in and a lot of people also saying thank you over YouTube for your talk. So we also have a live panel of some of our students from around the country. So if they want to jump in with a question at any point, they're welcome to. To start us off though in Q&A, I'm going to go to a question that was written in from one of our viewers on Zoom actually. She says, thank you so much for your words and witness tonight. I was deeply touched and it made me wonder what are practical ways that a woman can live out her vocation as a spouse and mother as a single university student?
Thanks for that question. It's a great question, and it's a time that I remember living, maybe not for very long. I got married a year after I finished being a university student. But gosh, as a wife and a mother now, I look back and think of the time when I was a college student, and I think I kind of wasted it. So you probably expected me to say that. But I was careful to mention that the kind of growth and maturity as a woman aiming at her complete development as a woman, as a spiritual mother, and to think of herself as a spouse to Christ, this is something we all need to work towards. So as a single college student, what would I have done differently? Maybe that's a way of asking the question, if I could go back to those years. And I'll tell you, let me put it this way. There's one comedian who says, what is it like to have 4 children? Well, it's like having 3. Imagine you're drowning and someone hands you a baby. So I would say something like this, that prayer, the life of prayer, is the key to all of the beautiful things I talked about tonight, right? But the life of prayer it's a virtue, and a virtue is a habit. And it's very hard to learn a habit when you're holding a baby. So when you have a new baby, little babies, it's like you're drowning a little bit. I'm exaggerating. It's the best thing ever. Okay, but what I would do differently if I were in your shoes is that I would work very hard to start to build up my spiritual muscles earlier. I would spend more time praying. I look back now and I think what I wouldn't give to be in control of my day. And although you are not in complete control of your day, you do have, there's what's the right word? It's a blessing of singleness. It's not, everyone's most preferred state in life, but a blessing of singleness is that you really do have the opportunity, say, to live out your daily conversation with God. And so I think if I were in your shoes, that is the thing I would make the most. I would make use of that time. It's kind of like an embarrassment of time. You will know this later when you get married and have children. You will realize, what did I do with all my time? So the best way, so the best way is to pray a lot. I don't mean like 8 hours a day, but to start to build the habit a little bit of time at a time. But when you do that, and as you do start to grow in your spiritual life, you will see many, many ways to exercise a kind of nurturing spirit towards the people around you, right? Tiny things supplying for people's needs. But that's actually the most maternal thing in the world. So, and it's, of course, available to you.
All right, great. Thank you for that. So our next question is from one of our live panelists over Zoom. Raquel has a question. So Raquel, go ahead.
Hello. So there are 2 of us here. This is Raquel and I'm Hala. And I am the one who's a Christian. And I was wondering regarding Professor Pakaluk's discussion of essence, is where exactly does a woman's essence rest? Is it something in her soul, in her body, or a communion of both of those things? And I'm thinking about this in distinct relation to conversations today of, gender and sex, and the way that those things are different, right, in many arguments, and the kind of gaps that are drawn between a person and their body. So what is that like in this sense of a woman's own essence?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And it's something that Edith Stein thought a lot about. And you may or may not know that Edith's position on this question is a tiny bit controversial in the tradition. So Edith believed that, following the Aristotelian principle that form causes matter, like form gives rise to matter, right? So matter doesn't give rise to anything, but form causes matter. So Edith believed that there must be something kind of causal in the spiritual principle of the female soul. Of course, the official teaching of the church, we don't believe that there are sort of female souls and male souls floating around. In fact, most of this has not been, we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. But I think the quickest, easiest way to kind of embrace this is, and the kind of the location, is to remember that you were never you without your body, right? That we were never we without our bodies, that we are this tight, we use the term hylomorphic union between our soul and our body. So it's very important, in fact, especially in light of the kinds of ideologies that you're mentioning, some of the confusion about sex and gender that we have now. It's very important to remember and to stress that we are who we are. We are completely embodied spirits, but we are completely embodied, right? We aren't sort of like there isn't me out there. I look down on my body, right? That this is a kind of dualism that the church has always rejected. Now, on the other hand, the fact that our femaleness is located in myself, in my body, right, doesn't mean that it's a physical thing, right? My femaleness is not captured by or fully determined by the shape of my body or exactly what it looks like. This is the marvel of the human person. We are just these amazing, amazing creatures that even, given our destiny, even the angels are jealous of us. So I would, let's see, to wrap up quickly so I don't take too much time, I would urge you to go ahead and read some of the essays that Edith Stein wrote where she does explore this. It's very accessible to any university student. I think you'll find this very readable. It's in the second volume of her collected works, which you can get on Amazon or probably any place else. Volume 2 of her essays on woman. And then I would urge you to read some of the other good contemporary Catholic thinkers who can tell you a little bit more about the way we should think about being embodied persons. That's a little bit truncated because in the interest of time, but I hope that kind of gets you started.
I think it does. That's great. Thank you. All right, we're going to go next to Sylvia, who is the president of our Yale chapter. Sylvia, go ahead.
Hello, Professor Pakaluk. Thank you for your outstanding and beautiful talk. So my question is twofold. Firstly, because men and women represent completely unique representations of spiritual and metaphysical realities, I'm curious to hear more about this in relation to the intellectual life. And I'm wondering if you yourself have noticed in your personal study and reading of female saints and philosophers and scholars, do they contribute anything uniquely feminine to the intellectual life? And secondly, what practical advice would you give to female students who would like to engage more with the intellectual life of the church? Thank you.
Yeah. Those are great questions, Sylvia. Thanks for asking them. I've thought a little bit about this. It's always dangerous to generalize too much. One thing that's delightful in Edith Stein is actually that she considered herself somewhat different from many, from sort of a typical woman, if you will. She was in a male field, right? She pursued philosophy at a time when there were almost no women in academia at all as an intellectual person. And so she gives a lot of scope in her thought about the person to the fact that different kinds of people may be drawn to different kinds of things. So I've just said that it's dangerous to generalize, but you've asked me to generalize, so I'll do it anyway. So what are the kinds of things? I guess what I will do is very briefly point you in the direction that I think I would be looking if I were to say there's a feminine type. Now, it's interesting that Edith Stein also says, for instance, that pure abstraction is almost the contrary of what a woman is suited for, pure abstraction. You could read that if you wanted to as some kind of slight, like women shouldn't do analytic philosophy or women shouldn't do pure math or something like that. And of course she didn't think that. She was a very analytic person herself. She didn't think that. But what she meant is that, of course, women are drawn to what's personal, that what is feminine, women are drawn to what's personal, which should tell us that sort of, if we were to just sort of let people assign themselves to kinds of inquiries in intellectual life, We might expect to see women more drawn to fields where there was a direct relation to personal stories, for instance, like great literature, or social science, for instance. We might see that as a sort of place where but so within these disciplines, do we see something like this? Maybe a preference for kind of qualitative work where we think about speaking to people and giving voice to people, that this would be a very feminine kind of way of doing work. Again, conscious that I'm generalizing. The other way, so the first way that you might look for something like a feminine emphasis in intellectual life would be to sort of follow the attention to the personal, because women are drawn to relationship. They are drawn to the personal and less to abstraction. This is the first place. The second place you might look is to kind of think about the notes of femininity that we see people like John Paul II and Edith Stein who think about the notes of the feminine. And so what do I mean there? I mean things like attention to beauty. We may see that there's a proclivity, right, that women who do intellectual work may be drawn to, say, even in mathematics, proofs which are especially beautiful, or language, like certain philosophical or theological works which are especially beautiful, or that they may be able to point us to what is beautiful. Another related point is this point about wholeness. So Edith Stein believed that the feminine was oriented to the whole precisely because it's her job to form a whole person within her whole body. So she thought, well, it would be understandable that if you were entrusted with a whole person, you shouldn't be drawn in your individual to sort of an extreme hyper-specialization, right? Like, what good would it be to have a mother who could only do one thing? Right? In fact, your mother needs to be able to read books and make pretty good mac and cheese, right? I mean, it's just kind of keep going like that. Chesterton talked a little bit about that as well. So this kind of orientation to the general. And so here's another possibility that we see the general is also marked by integration, right? So you take these competing parts of reality and seek to integrate them. And so a place you might look for a kind of feminine note or characteristic in intellectual life would be that we might see women either more suited to or drawn to the interest in integrating things across disciplines, interdisciplinary studies, for instance, of various kinds, reaching for the whole instead of the part. Those would all be things which would be sort of characteristic of kind of feminine notes in academic or intellectual work. I think you asked another part of the question, which you're going to have to remind. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to remind me. What was your second question? It was something more practical. Can she restate? Sylvia, go ahead.
Yes, it was just for practical advice for us female students if we would like to engage more with the intellectual life of the church.
Yeah, so the best thing I can say, and what has served me so well in my lifetime, and is actually to read. So to engage with the intellectual life of the church has to be a project of love. Certainly engaging with the intellectual life of the church, unless you happen to be an academic theologian, is probably not going to be your career. So it's a project that you engage out of love, right? And to do this, you have to read widely, right? So you've probably read, many, many thousands of pages of texts about your discipline, whichever discipline you happen to be in. So I would just start, if you haven't, picking up these great works and building on them. And I want to encourage you in this respect, although we don't have many, at least by numbers, and I've rejected entirely the idea that we could weigh anything by numbers and metrics. We don't have many female saints who are known principally for their intellectual work. As a matter of fact, even the male saints who are intellectuals and scholars do not become saints because of their intellectual work, right? You become a saint because of heroic virtue. And you may exercise that virtue in the intellectual space. But, and so what I mean there is that the best thing to do is to start reading and reflecting. And the great thing about these works is you can spend a lifetime reading St. Catherine and not get the whole of it, because of course it isn't a mere invention of one corner of St. Catherine's brain, right? It's something that's, it's a receptive work. And this is, now I'll say something slightly general about intellectual work in general, right? Wisdom is, Sophia is a woman, or is a feminine, we'll say, not a woman, but a feminine. The reception of wisdom from God, which of course any scholar, we have a completely secularized view of what scholarship is, but scholarship, of course, from in its origin is the reception of wisdom. This is, in some sense, it has a feminine posture. It's a receptive activity. So even our male colleagues have a feminine posture. We can speak about that in relation to the reception of truth from God. And so this should be very easy for us to do. Actually, contemplative life is something that is we are well suited to doing. And so actually, I mean, I think there are lots of reasons to think that not only can we make better use of the text that we have before us and the intellectual contributions, but there's actually a lot to be plumbed there and a lot to be built on. And the relative numbers of intellectual saints, one way or the other, doesn't concern me at all. So kind of get a stack of books and put them on your nightstand and kind of, read 15 minutes every night. I have a friend who read the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas Aquinas in like 15 minutes every night before he went to bed. It took him like 20 years. So that could be very daunting, but I would start by, as women, I would start by reading the women saints. There's so much there, so yeah.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Well, perhaps I'll just check in with you, Professor Pakaluk. How are we doing on time? Do we have time for one more question?
We do have time.
Okay,
yep.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Our last question for the evening then is coming to us from one of our viewers on Zoom again, Grace Regnier. Go ahead, Grace.
Dr. Pakaluk, thank you so much for your talk. I was just thinking about how, we have natures that we don't choose. Like, we don't choose to be women, and we don't really choose to have maternity in our essence. And it's something that I sort of like subconsciously find myself rejecting. And I think that it's pretty common nowadays for women to just kind of reject that too. We reject the idea of maternity in our essence because we find it to be just sort of groomed in us to be something subjective, oppressive, right? And I was just wondering, why do you think that we have that drive to reject maternity as our essence? Where do you think that comes from? Thank you.
So that's a great question and kind of a deep question, but that's okay. We're here for deep, right? We wouldn't be Thomistic Institute. So listen, I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say, where does that drive come from? On some level, the drive to reject what is good for us, it comes from the devil. So I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say that. But actually, like, if we were to spend a lot of time, as I've done, if you spend a lot of time reading the medieval saints, the saints in the history of the church, it's actually super, super helpful to kind of de-psychologize bad tendencies in ourselves, right? I mean, this current time, there is a time and a place for psychology, and it's a beautiful thing, and when it's done well, it's really sublime. There's a time and a place for that. But it can be very freeing to realize that I am not the source of all the evil in my life. Right? That there are I have mentioned them in this talk even. There are opponents of God, the opponents of God. Like, God has enemies, and God's enemies are your enemies. Right? God's enemies are our enemies, and they don't want you to embrace these things. Now, I will say that's the clearest and simplest answer I can say to the source of any slight rebellion that you feel in yourself. But full stop. Don't be too hard on yourself, right? This isn't like you're not steeped in the devil. That's not my answer. You live in a time when, and this is a painful thing to say, you live in a time when from the very first minute you stepped into school and you started to use your intellectual faculties, which is a great joy, right? You've been given a great gift from God, and that was a great joy to start to learn how to use it. Anybody that's made it this far and you're here with the Thomistic Institute, you love to study. On some level, you do love to study. But you've been raised in a time when that drive in you to study and to contemplate has been twisted into a thing that's directed at a certain kind of professionalism, which isn't its purpose. And it sets you up for the sense that this other thing that you are also called to do is somehow at odds, right? That your love of truth and your love of study, and you sense that you're good at this. You sense like, I'm great at this. You know, I really get this, right? And so you've sensed from the beginning that so this is why I say don't be too hard on yourself. Every negative tendency is from the devil, right? But on this particular point, over the years, I've talked with so many young women in college who think or who feel very torn. Like, here I am, I've done all this, I've invested so much in my intellectual formation and couldn't, it seems as if I go follow this path, which seems that what God has designed me for, just, run off and get married when I'm 22 and have 1 million kids like you, like, it'll just be a big failure, right? I mean, like, it won't work. I won't fulfill this investment of time. And so I think it's just fair to take stock of that and to recognize that in some sense, on some level, you've been handed a contradiction. And there's no other way to say it. Now, the contradiction isn't entirely a bad thing. I love that we've all gone to school as long as we have. I don't think we should go back to some kind of time when girls stopped studying when they were 12 and they just started to get ready for their weddings when they were like, that's not my suggestion for you. But there is a contradiction. Time is a rival good, we like to say. You can't do all things with the same amount of intensity. And so you will have some choices to make at some point. However, I am a firm believer, I think I said this at least once, that God gives desires in your heart that he's prepared to fulfill if you work with him, right? And you put those desires at his feet. You have desires for to do great work in some field, to build something, to do something that ordinarily, say, wives and mothers don't do. It's okay. God gave you the desire. He'll give you the means to make it fruitful. Even if that means that some aspect of your imagination had to be put to death. I definitely thought I would be driving a sports car at my age, but I'm not. And so that part of my, because I'm a really great driver, I'm convinced, but like that part of me, clearly it wasn't important for me to have fulfilled. But God did give me the tools and the capacity to write things and to study. And this part of my life is deeply fulfilling. And I think it's made me a better wife and a better mother. So I think the answers to these things are not pat, they're not simple, but they're there. So.